Good morning, everybody. Getting this going after a few technical difficulties. My name's Tim Taplin. We're here to talk about an application called YRES. And just a few quick shots of where we're broadcasting from here in southwestern Colorado. Building with Perfect. What is YRES? Well, this app was developed for entrepreneurs, innovators, and business owners in the York region and near Toronto, Canada. Lucas Chang brought me this idea and provided an excellent design document with layouts and app specifications. But really, what's the point? Well, we wanted to build an app in Swift and then build the back end also using Swift. We used Perfect Turnstile for authentication in the MySQL connector. And then we deployed this with the Perfect Assistant on EC2. Here's a few screenshots of what some of the graphics look like that I was originally given. You can see the layouts are fairly clean, nicely thought through, and noting that the navigation screen, what you want to do, is a little bit, could be a little bit challenging. So here's a look at one of the first challenges that I got. We had excellent design documents, as I mentioned before, but sometimes these lengthy Photoshop layers were challenging to get the content from. All of the actual content of the app was presented using these documents. Why did I go backwards? We have a simple app structure. Simple splash screen and a similar initial layout view in the app, and then a list view for the rest of the content. The Nav View was a little more challenging. Had to work out some interesting details of how to lay out those buttons. We created a navigation grid, and I'm showing some of these screenshots here. I know the text is going to be a little small. I'm hoping to get through this portion fairly quickly, and then we'll take a look in a little bit better in Xcode to see some more details. The challenge here was to create this dynamic layout so that it would fit on different size screens and retain that very simple, clean layout for the navigation grid. I found an excellent tutorial on Winderlic.com and modified it to use on our screen where we didn't actually want scrolling. The example that we found was showing to allow various scrolling with different sizes of displays. We used it to actually create a single consistent layout across multiple screen sizes. You can see over on the right there's some nice calculations going on, figuring out where the layout goes and doing that as the screen comes up. Initially, we set this up with core data, but we wound up moving to a static file load. Initially, I used plist files and then had to switch over to a JSON format once we went over to the Linux hosting version. I left the core data implementation in the app because we expect to use data syncing in the future, and so we'll want to be actually connecting with live data and synchronizing things across from the server. So currently we're just simply, when it loads up, it loads the data from the file and chucks it into memory. We just hang on to it there and reference it on the fly as we draw our various screens. You can see the loading from content from plist. Again, I had to rewrite some of this after this went live to utilize JSON files instead of a plist file. Here's three main topics that we want to talk about on the server side. The server writing the data out to the file. We're going to talk about the Turnstile implementation, and then we'll take a quick peek at what the actual web admin console looks like. So in the way that we set this up was that we wanted a console for someone like Lucas to come in and update the content and then be able to save that out to a file so that when we built the next version of the app, we would just pull in that file and build the app and run off with it. So initially, I just grabbed the data from the database and built the plist locally. Eventually, I was able to go back and rewrite so that it saves out to a JSON file for the next round that we're going to be working with. The Turnstile implementation, I had looked at it a little bit before we started off with this, but it had always been a little bit challenged to understand. It felt like there were some missing pieces. It felt like I didn't really grasp what was going on. Once I got my head around it, though, it actually turned out to be a fairly simple piece. There are some ORM implementations that include Turnstile. I personally didn't, they actually kind of threw me an extra curve and got me more confused on Turnstile. I'm hoping to spend some more time on that in the near future and get my head around working with the ORMs as well. The Turnstile implementation basically just required us to do a really simple create an account store, which is exactly what it sounds like. It doesn't require more than a few simple requirements. It's a method of going in and pulling out your account information, and we pass that into the Turnstile implementation. It actually sounded more difficult when I looked at the documentation than it actually was. You can see here some of the code that is my account store class, and all it's doing is grabbing data out of the database and returning it in a JSON in an object format. The Realm implementation, equally harder looking in the documentation than it was to implement. I just basically conform to the protocol, create the credentials authentication. I didn't use or provide the additional Facebook and Google authentications that were offered here, but really only had to make the minor changes of pointing it to my version of the account store and use this example really easily. The account object that I created is where we'd store that information and then just make sure all these pieces can talk to each other. Really simple implementation once you kind of get started on it. Hopefully having some of this code up on online will make it easier for some other people to use Turnstile. I think that it's an excellent authentication library and provides a lot of flexibility because you get to build your objects however works for your solution and then just allow them to conform to these three simple pieces. The admin console is set up using fairly straightforward routes. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible using Mustache Templates and some basic Ajax functionality. Here's what my incredibly complex admin screen looks like before and after logging in. And then we can take a look at real simple layout, go in and edit, search, filter, different functions like that. One of the interesting challenges that I had, if you look on the left-hand side there's a list, and initially I just assumed that I would take the checkboxes, fill in the data, and save changes. Because of the various ways you could add, subtract, change the checkboxes, it was a little bit challenging to store that. So what I wound up doing is I made that list its own Ajax function so that anytime you make a change there, it's immediately updated in the database rather than waiting for you to click save. And that wound up being simple, where trying to figure out which things had previously been checked versus the things that were currently checked was a rather complex solution. So I'm hoping that that's something that works out well in the long term. as we come back and use this interface. Here's what our layouts wound up looking like. We made a minor change from the initial layout where we added an extra icon and allowed the search section to gain its own icon on the screen. But you can see the icons lay themselves out. This works on everything from an iPhone 4 up to an iPad. The icons don't blow up quite as big on an iPad when you bring that in, but we were also able to bring in a number of different navigation items to the layout itself. The server code is posted on GitHub. Here's the URL for that. Please feel free to take a look at it and see if it helps you out with getting started, or if it's even some useful code to use in your own projects. So that's the end of the basic kind of overview presentation. I'd love to get a few questions. I've got a couple of people helping me by passing through some information from the chat screen so I can see what's going on there. If there's anything in particular that you'd like to take a look at, let me know. I'm going to bring up the code for the server itself in Xcode and take a look at that. I was hoping that I might have a question or two, or does anyone want to make a suggestion for what you'd like to see? I want to take a look at the account store real quickly. This is one area of working with Turnstile that initially really baffled me. And once I figured out that I just needed to go in and load the data and make it accessible through the anticipated functions, it came out relatively simply. So I'm just trying to think of where the best place to be to look at the code here. Let's actually go look at what the Mustache templates themselves look like for this layout. If we go over here in Coda, we can look at our basic index page, checking that you're authenticated. Let me see if I can bring the text up in size. So we've got our basic login index page, which will redirect to login if you're not logged in. There's our login screen, and then a listing. Again, this is super simple, but there's I think there's value in simplicity. There's a question about different user types. In this particular project, since the back end is purely for admin users, I didn't do anything with that. On some other projects I have done that. I would expect that to just be a flag in the user account. Let's see. So if we were to look at YRES account, I would assume that I would add an additional property here, as a public var that would store what type of a user they were. That way, again, it just keeps things as simple and transparent as possible. I can always look at that. Some things that I tend to do, I would add a property, and I would likely also add a function of like isAdmin, so that rather than having to hit the property itself, I can just call isAdmin. So when I'm working with different levels of users, I typically want to ask it a question rather than inspect a variable. There's also a question here about why keep the data loaded instead of a refresh process. Because we're loading it from a document that was included in the app build itself, and I'm not actually, when I load that document, I'm not saving it into core data. I'm loading it straight into an array and using that as my data source during the life of the app. So there isn't anything to refresh when we start up the app. In the future, once we link this app directly to the back end, then obviously we'd have data stored in the app, and then we would do a refresh and synchronization process. So I think hopefully that makes sense. That was my thought process, at least, in why I chose to leave the data where it would load each time the app started. I think one of the realities with the majority of apps like this is someone fires it up, and the only time it has to be actually restarted is whenever they start their phone up again after installing a new system. So a lot of people just leave these apps running. So it was a trade-off. I went for the super simplest solution that I could think of. Let's go back and look at some of the Mustache templates again. Our basic register, let's look at an edit piece. So here's just laying out a form in to show the list and give us an option to update things. I think that unless I have any more questions, which it looks like I don't, I think I'm going to basically wrap up here. We might plan on putting together a more in-depth focus on one or more areas here. I've got a few other projects that we might be able to use as examples in the future. So hopefully, if you get a chance to check this video out and there's something that I didn't cover or that you'd like to get into in more detail, let me know. I'd be happy to put something together. So have a great morning.